this computer. Why does that look like? I did it yesterday, so hopefully it'll work.
It's recording.
Thank you. So I just want to start out by, I'm going to ask anybody if they put themselves on mute. Looks like everybody but me and Gina are doing that. And I'm going to introduce this friend I have here and invited to speak with us today. So as some of you know, like I am doing a create your own school community. This has been the weekly meetup. And I've been inviting guests to come and talk to our growing community directly. And we can ask questions in the chat. We'll try and get to answer them as we go, or we'll answer them at the end if it doesn't fit into the flow. But let me first introduce who we have here today. So Gina Riley is a Ph.D. and a clinical professor and program coordinator of the Adolescent Special Education program at CUNY-Hunter College in New York City. She is, Dr. Riley has extensive experience in online education and distance learning at the college and university level. And for the past 18 years, her research has concentrated on topics related to homeschooling, unschooling, intrinsic and self-determination, or intrinsic motivation and self-determination. And her interest stemmed in part from unschooling her own child from birth to 12th grade. Her recent peer-reviewed articles have young adult unschooling outcomes, homeschooling and intrinsic motivation, unschoolers who identify as LGBTQ, and how unschoolers learn to read, which is always a big topic. She has a new book that just came out, Unschooling, and Exploring Learning Beyond the Classroom. So I'm so grateful to Gina for doing this with us today. She has been very helpful to my learning journey in this space. I met her. I went to a workshop of hers at an Aero conference in 2017, I believe, and then I reached out to her when I was writing my paper that became a book chapter called Is Self-Directed Education the Answer to the Creativity Crisis? And she was the one who recommended I get this very big book on self-determination theory, which was extremely helpful. And so I am a student of her work, and I am very grateful for her to be here today. So,
I'm so grateful to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, so the last time me and Gina worked together, she had invited me to be on at the beginning of this pandemic. She coordinated a series of emergency homeschooling webinars. It was a drop-in session. And mine I attended or was part of the panel on at the end of March. So we sort of have been, this is kind of not the end of the pandemic, obviously, but it is the next sort of big decision points for parents. So I thought it would be really good to have this conversation between us. So before we get into the conversation, because I don't want to lose track of my own points on some things I want to say, is that I want to sort of distinguish something, that there's a difference when we're talking about learning with content and context. And so this is something really important to me and what I'm doing. And I'm sure, Gina, we have never talked on this topic, but I want to lay out sort of where my thinking currently is so that she, when she goes and starts to tell all of what she can tell, she can maybe work this in. But so what most people, when I've been talking about self-directed education, people have a lot of preconceived notions on what that is. And sometimes they shut down instantly. And, or if they hear unschooling, they think it's like a complete free for all. And it is a challenge to try and help people understand the difference and what it really is, which I hope we can do today. But what we're doing right now is self-directed education. Like, we're here to learn. If you're tuning in and you care about the topic, you're learning. Nobody's going to grade you. There's no assignments, there's no tests. And so that's just one thing to keep in mind, that this is a context of self-directed education. The other thing that's worth noting is that a lot of us, and most of the people that are currently involved in this create your own school community, I have met in Seth Godin's Akimbo workshops, which as a context is designed in a way where the community becomes the curriculum. Seth sets a very much like a prompt, let me get under your skin, let me get you thinking in a certain way. And it's really the conversations that happen between the people, like the one last week with me and Jethro, like all the conversations happening with me and Jethro. Danica, I met with yesterday, and, because she prompted why don't we do an Akimbo online school? And I was like, yes, Akimbo online high school, or Akimbo-like, because, Seth wants his people that sort of follow his work to take on and do those kinds of things. So those are all things where the context is what's teaching more than the content. And that's really where I think it's an overlap with self-directed education. But there's whole other terms for this. Like in self-directed education, I don't hear the words rhizomatic learning happening a lot, but in open education, at the college level, that's a term, and it really is. Community is the curriculum is what that is. And so I just wanted to, before you kind of dig into telling us more about what I think everybody wants to hear, which is, the story of how you embrace this from the beginning with your own child. I know I've gotten questions on, people who have to work 2 and 3 jobs. So, or equity, and is this really accessible only to rich people? Like there's that kind of thing that I'm sure you could talk to. I also think people have asked me about the parents' role in this. And I'd like to just reframe that as the learning facilitator's role, because the parent is operating as learning facilitator, but you can be an educator that operates as a learning facilitator with kids. And really, so facilitator's role, context, community, and basically, is it accessible to people who have to work? Those are a couple of things because I don't like having to force questions, Gina. So I wanted you to just tell it like it is.
Happy to. So just a little background. So I got interested in unschooling really through self-determination theory and intrinsic motivation. I was a young undergrad. I had a very young child, and the concept of intrinsic motivation seemed really exciting to me. At the time, I was studying psychology, and I fell in love with positive psychology. And so this whole you can do what you love thing became really, really interesting to me. Meanwhile, I was literally a poor single mother trying to raise my child and living in my parents' basement and trying to figure out my way in the world, as well as my way of parenting and my way of what to do next with this beautiful child in front of me. And so he was 5. He was really interested in rocks. He was figuring out chemical compositions of rocks. And while he's doing that, I'm thinking, he's going to go to kindergarten and learn his ABCs. And we are way beyond that, right? Like he's interested in the periodic table now. What do I do? At the time, I was getting ready to do a master's thesis, and my master's thesis was on intrinsic motivation in homeschoolers. Again, I was just trying out this concept, right? I was just trying out this mending of self-determination and intrinsic motivation of homeschoolers, and this mending of what do I do with my child for kindergarten? Thankfully, kindergarten was not mandatory in New York State at the time, so I felt like I could get away with not sending him. Of course, the minute I did that and made that decision, I mean, it was rough. Unschooling in early 2000s, homeschooling was rough. People didn't do it. People didn't know what it meant. They thought your child was truant. And so it took a lot of convincing of my parents and neighbors and friends that it was okay. We were just doing it for that year. And, kindergarten, again, wasn't mandatory. So we're just going to try this out. And so we tried it out, and it was a joy. I mean, we went on trips and we learned through the community, and he would go over my neighbor's house and the neighbor would teach him all about his old car. And he really seemed to love that. He was still interested in geology. And so this became this really cool year. And it just kept going. Every year I would ask him, would you like to go to school? Do you prefer to be home? Well, and it was really neutral to me. I didn't care what he chose. And at the time, truly, if he chose going to school, it would have probably led for me to have an easier life. I could work more, I could do more research, not at 3 o'clock in the morning. And so it really was this neutral choice. Do you want to? And every year he said, yeah, I just want to continue doing what I'm doing. There were a couple of times in his teenage years where he's like, you know what, I want to explore other schools. And so he would explore, and then he would come back to unschooling for whatever reason. And so, yeah, I mean, this is not, and I want to make this really clear, right? I always will think that homeschooling and unschooling is a choice. It's a choice among the very many choices that parents have. In my life, I run a program teaching adolescent special educators. I teach New York City school teachers, and I love them. I think the work they're doing is the best work in the world. And so this is not one thing is better than the other. This is just public education, private education, homeschooling, unschooling. It's all a choice that you really do have to make for your individual family as well as for your individual child. And I think that that choice thing is coming into play in this pandemic, right? Everyone is making a choice. And then again, people are being judged for choice. So I just want to open the conversation up. Again, I'm in two worlds, right? I might have unschooled my son, but I also teach New York City school teachers all day and love and respect and enjoy doing that and love them and think they're doing everything in the world they can for their students. So the choice part is really important here. In terms of equity and in terms of it being a choice for all, I am living proof that it was a choice for all. I was a young, single, poor mother going to graduate school and working 2 or 3 jobs, and I was still unschooling. My parents played a big role in taking care of my son when I was at school, but to be honest with you, I also brought him a lot. I brought him to work, I brought him to school. And so we teased that he accidentally grew up in academia. But he did accidentally grow up there, right? I think we thought back, and his first college class, I brought him to an art history class as an undergrad, and he was literally 12 weeks old. So I just stood in the back, and he was a good baby, thank goodness, and could handle it. And you know, we just every day, it was a choice. So again, it's a choice, and it's a choice for all. And what we're seeing in terms of data and demographics is that more and more people in many different circumstances are making this choice. So you have homeschoolers and unschoolers of many different backgrounds. You have homeschoolers and unschoolers that are single parents, married parents, whatever their family structure. And so this is no longer, you know, the property of the rich or left-wing, you know, the hippies or right-wing conservatives. This is really a choice for all. And it is, I mean, the wonderful thing about this choice is it's learning through community and learning through context. And so there are ways to really bring in community into that choice. I don't know what I'd do without my neighbor who taught my son about, you know, his antique car and car parts. He spent hours with my son while I was working. My mother I was an educator, a guidance counselor, spent hours with my son. It really was a community project. We had people in our homeschool group, and we would go on trips together, and we would do like little homeschooling co-ops in the year 2000, which were not called pandemic pods. They were just called, like, we were getting together so like we could work and you know, also have childcare for our kids. So there are many ways to do this, and I hope right now that it doesn't seem like such a scary choice. For me, it was a scary choice. There weren't a lot of people doing it. I felt like the only people doing it were the ones that I read about in Growing Without Schooling, right? But now it's a really open choice. And my hope is that this time, I won't say post-pandemic, I hope it's post-pandemic soon, but I hope that this time, we've been talking a lot, even in the college realm, about reimagining education and re-envisioning what education is. And my hope is that this time is that for all, and that unschooling does play a role in that reimagining or re-envisioning.
Excellent. Yeah. So you went into a lot of things there, which I knew you would. So I'm going to try and just sort of talk about the one where you ended on the scary note, right? And that was definitely a theme when we had the emergency homeschooling meeting, was really just trying to reassure people that you really can't I mean, if you're care as a parent, you really can't screw this up. Like, that's just, do you agree with that? Like, you just can't, it's so,
Yes, many parents, I mean, you know, Nicole, and you gave such good advice at that emergency homeschooling session. So many parents came on like, am I going to mess up my kid? And I'm thinking, no, you have all the tools that you need. This is going to be a growing and a learning and an amazing experience, right? Teachers are tools and teachers are incredible, but they are not the be all end all for your child. So it's been an interesting experience to see the fear, right? And I think that's what stops people from doing this is the fear, what's going to happen. In my case, it was the fear of like having CPS called and getting my child taken away, but that's not going to happen in 2020. Now it's the fear of really making a choice that might be preconceived as different. But it's not as different as it was 20 years ago, I'll tell you that. And that's a real good thing.
yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that I emphasize to parents is like to remind them that they were, and Jethro talked about this last week too, they were their child's first educator. They are their child's primary educator, even if they're not actively doing content teaching. The context of their family, the culture that exists, and the ways of interacting in that family speak so much more to how that child actually grows up. So then if you sit there and say at this moment in time where you have so many parents who are like, what do I do now in the fall? Like, I'm not comfortable with that. I'm not comfortable. And my youngest is 23, so I don't have that problem. And I can totally empathize though with what they're up against. And yet fear as being, so my goal, I'll say, is to help remove the fear and also to provide the community where they can, as new homeschooling parents, new unschooling curious, like all of those. And even where I talked to Danica, who I met just recently, and said, you're a person who's in the professional world who just has this heart for education and wants to make a difference. Like, people who are doing this work in their homes are going to need cheerleaders like you. You all heard her at the beginning. She's got such great energy. Like, I want to create this playground where inside of an akimbo-like community, a workshop space, you can imagine what you want. Like, what's your definition of success? What are you going to measure? Sometimes, I think it was Kara maybe last week said the smile on her face. Like, measure the smile on her face as evidence of learning and living and health and wellness and all those things. So really, I'm excited about this project, and we currently have a small closed community, but we're getting ready to open it up, right in time for parents are saying, oh my gosh, now I'm doing it. Like, so reach out to us if you are doing it, or even if you're just curious and want to imagine in your mind and create in words on a paper, or words on a screen to your community, what it is you would intend to do if you chose this. So I want to make that, kind of bridging this very uncomfortable transition, because really, and this was the thing, you came to it from intrinsic motivation. I came to it from creativity. I was studying creativity and came to the conclusion that, everybody has seen Sir Ken Robinson's video, TED Talk, Are Schools Killing Creativity? In my opinion, they definitively are. There is a lot of evidence that says the ways in which they are currently structured. That doesn't mean that it's the fault of the people. Like you're saying, these educators are amazing. They want to do, but the system has refused to change for just this whole time. And now I guess that would just be because you kind of have that one foot into that education space. I also have the foot, not where you are, but like teaching at the college level. And I know as an individual educator, I can choose to do things differently. I can push my academic freedom as far as they'll let me, and so I don't think that high school and K through 12 may have maybe as much freedom, but better, what can they do? Because there's going to be a lot of educators who are like, okay, I hear what you're saying. How can I maybe do some things in my own classroom?
Yeah, love that question. And I just want to say I love what you're doing, because what homeschooling and unschooling curious and unschooling families really need is that support. They need cheerleaders. They're making a very, very different decision that can be viewed as socially unacceptable, as we know through research. And so having those cheerleaders, those people who are saying, yes, this is possible, and look how much you can do, is such an amazing support. So thank you for providing that space for people. What can schools do? What can teachers do? This is my favorite, right? It's all about bringing intrinsic motivation, self-directed learning into the classroom. I talk a lot. I don't talk a lot about this to my teachers. My teachers maybe get this once every 2 years. But I talk a lot about self-determination theory, Edward Dacey and Richard Ryan, and I talk a lot about the sub-theory, which is cognitive evaluation theory. And I keep saying it's like fancy name, easy stuff, right? So you have intrinsic motivation. Of course, we want all students to do what they love and what they're interested in. And we want teachers to be able to teach what they love and are interested in too, right? So there, of course, you can't force intrinsic motivation or self-determination, because that would be extrinsic. So you have to find ways to facilitate it. And so what I always tell my teachers is, you can use these ways, and I call it the magic of teaching, to facilitate self-determination and intrinsic motivation in your kids. And there's 3 things. And the first thing is, you want to give all your students, whether they be homeschooled or public schooled and you're the teacher, you want to give them a sense of competence, a noticing and knowing of their own strengths, a sense of, you can do this. You are perfectly capable of doing this. When people know that they have a sense of competence, when people know that they can do things, it's easier for them to do them successfully. So, giving students a sense of competence is important. The second part is scary to my public school teachers, but again, something that we talk about all the time as best practice, and that's giving students a sense of autonomy, a sense of choice, a sense of freedom in their learning. And again, like for public school teachers, that part is a little hard, because we tend to say, oh, freedom and choice and classroom, it, sometimes it's hard, but we talk about starting with little choices. So if you're a math teacher and you always want your kids to do their math problems in pencil, let's branch out a little, right? Let's allow pens, let's allow markers, let's allow like little stuff like that. What about choice textbooks? What about choice books? What about choice ways that individuals can do assignments? So if you're always assigning the essay, would it be so horrible if your students chose a video instead, or like a mini documentary instead? So it's that choice, and whether they're little choices or big choices, it makes a huge difference in education. It makes a huge difference in the way that individuals feel about themselves, and a huge difference in the way that individuals feel about education. My gosh, if I have choice and freedom, then I can choose what I love. I can choose what I'm interested in. And this is really important for the facilitation of intrinsic motivation. The third thing is a sense of relatedness. My teachers are so good at this. They really know how to form relationships and good relationships with their students. And parents have this automatically, right? They know their kids. The relationship part is important. And so having that relationship is essential to facilitating intrinsic motivation. Also, the relatedness part sounds easy, a little bit hard, because relatedness also means having unconditional support and acceptance no matter what. So yeah, right, the no matter what. So if your kid chooses to play guitar all day, which is my son chose to do for a very long time when he was 16, you have to be unconditionally accepting and supporting no matter what. He didn't choose history. He didn't choose like an interest in medicine. He chose the guitar. So it was important to be unconditionally supportive of that choice. P.S. This has led to amazing things for him. He's 24 years old. He owns his own music education business, and he is a graduate student in music theory with a 4.0 average. So, I mean, it has not been wasted on him. That competence, the autonomy, the relatedness. Again, that's the key to good teaching. That's the key to facilitating intrinsic motivation. And that's really the key in any educational environment, just to have this self-determined learning.
Yeah. So I had said, Jethro had talked a lot about choice and his attempts to do the self-directed within a public school. So I want him to speak to that, but I also just want to say that I definitely want to also pick up on the social thread after that. And because relatedness, there's a lot of concern with like as if school relationships and the social scene there is so much better or more nourishing than you can create. So I don't want to forget to get to that. And I also know that I also want to talk about people who might want to do it for just 1 year and like, what's the transition back and forth? So even if Jethro has anything, but I know he specifically had a lot to say about, you know, the choice thing being like the minimum, but how he has maybe done it a little bit even above and beyond. So.
Yeah, I mean, that was fantastic. I'm really loving this conversation, Gina. So thank you so much for allowing us to listen in. I think that's really cool. The competence, autonomy, and relatedness, I think are so powerful. And I love the story about your son being totally into the guitar and wanting to do that and not wanting to do anything else. Because wouldn't we all love if our kids really loved something? I think we would. And so if it's the guitar, I mean, sure, that'd be great if he was really into whatever it took to become a doctor and then became a rich, wonderful doctor that we could all be proud of. But the reality is you're still proud of him no matter what he's interested in, right? And that's the thing that I think we in the public arena are really missing, because we have this system that's designed to get kids to a certain place, to master certain standards, and kids still fall through the cracks a ton in that system. But if he is, you know, I always say we can give choice because we have tons of kids who aren't doing what we want them to anyway. So what are we really losing by having that happen? But what I love about this is that when you give them that competence, that autonomy and relatedness, and that unconditional support that you talked about, you inspire them to go further and deeper into something than they ever would have before. And that's what I really love. And I saw that every time I gave kids an opportunity in school to do something they were passionate about, then they went way deeper, did way more than if I would have set the standard and said, here's what you need to do. They would have stopped when they got to the standard. When I give them those 3 things, then they're like, oh, I need to be competent at this. Well, competence doesn't mean that I can just do this one problem this one time. Competence means that I can do this repeatedly over time, that I can play the guitar for hours at a time. I just love that. I think that's so great. So I don't have a question or anything to add, but I just want to say thank you. I think that's great.
Yeah. But I mean, what Jethro shared also is, and what we've talked about is the fact that you can, as an educator, you can let them do their thing. You know the standards. Instead of using the standards to guide the instruction, use the standards to capture the learning that happened. And I mean, that to me, the standards is, and that whole way of doing it is why I didn't even pursue being a teacher. As soon as I walked in as a substitute, exploring the possibility, I was quickly like, I want no part of that. But if I was able to teach in the way that his vision is, and that it is self-directed, and, you know, of course they're meeting reading standards when they're able to do that, you know, of course they're meeting, it's just a complete flip, not a flipped classroom, because that's helpful, but this is, you know, can really make a bigger difference. And I just don't know if you've seen anywhere where that's done, or would be a recommendation to others who might try and go that direction. Like, because again, in my space, I want to have a place where people can try and imagine how could they make that work on an ongoing basis. But if someone else is doing that work already, then, let me tell us where they are. But
Yeah.
otherwise, like, I want public school teachers who want to say, how can I turn my own classroom into like a school that I would want to be running? What freedoms do they have? And I think if he was able to do it, then other teachers have that ability too. Like, it's an option. So
yeah, it is an option. I mean, the whole last chapter of my book was really dedicated to how can we, respect the realm of unschooling, but also how can we bring it into the realm of public education or even private education. So of course you have your free schools and your democratic schools, and Hudson Valley Sudbury School and other Sudbury schools are great examples of what you can do when kids have free autonomy and choice. But you also have some really interesting other public spaces where people have done this. So there is a project, or was a project, called the Independence Project at Great Barrington High School. And, it was started by a student who said, I would like to do something I love for some of the day, right? And he went to his guidance counselor, and his guidance counselor's like, well, let's see what we can do. So they created this half-day independence project where students were really just enmeshed in the world of self-directed learning and doing what they wanted to do and creating projects that were of their choice and projects that they would then, in terms of assessment, display or talk about at the end of the semester, right? So we talk about assessment and quantitative assessment. Well, this was a real portfolio-based assessment, except it was really student-led. There's also David Lane as an educator who at his previous school did something called the Independent Project. And I love this one because I think that this is really something that actual public schools can do. He is such a proponent of self-directed, self-determined learning. And he was just like, listen, to his administrators, give me one period. Give me one period a day. And I call it like one period a day. That's what it was called in my chapter of my book. Give me one period a day that kids could engage in something that they needed to do, or that they wanted to do, or that they loved. And so what ended up happening is, of course, one period a day of freedom for some high schoolers is a lot. So some kids just decided to kind of do nothing for a little bit of a while. And other kids decided to create these projects. And yes, and Jethro said he did it at his school. So I want to hear about this. And it's awesome. It's one period, right? Other kids there was one kid who was mourning the loss of his dad. And it's such a interesting story. So he needed that time and space to sort of do nothing for a while. And then one day he was like, my dad always loved surfing, always loved surfboards. I want to make a surfboard. So he spent that semester making a surfboard, also honoring his dad and probably going through whatever, emotions you have to
processing.
Processing when someone you love has been lost, but also creating something. And so David Lane talks about his creating of a surfboard and how it didn't really work out. It ended up being a skimboard instead, but the student knew why it didn't work out. He's like, I used the wrong chemical compositions of materials, and that's why it didn't float the way I wanted it to. So that's an amazing story and something that's very doable. And I want to hear how Jethro did it too. There's also High Tech High School. And High Tech High School, again, is a really, really interesting sort of project-based learning school. If you've ever looked at High Tech High School or watched or seen images or pictures of it, it's a very open space. Individuals are really engaging in projects, and a lot of them are very STEM science-based.
The Big Picture Schools is another one that they're based. The Met in Rhode Island is the original one. They actually came out with College Unbound, so they did a college version of it as well. So that's definitely a great example. I'd love to hear from Jethro what his example was. I think he might have shared something last week, but if he has something.
Yeah, so we started out doing one period per day, and it was our advisory period. And what we found was that teachers had a really hard time breaking away from teaching their content. And so we created a totally separate period that wasn't advisory or anything else. It was just called, we called it Synergy. Name doesn't really matter. I just made that name up because it sounded cool. And basically we said, you're not a content area teacher during this time. you are a coach to help kids figure out what they want to do. Some kids did amazing things. Other kids totally wasted that time. But my personal belief is that those kids needed downtime where they didn't have anything pushing them and they needed a break, because those who were motivated and could do it, they jumped in and did amazing things. And I've got like a million stories. I could talk for hours about this, but I'll share just one really quick one. These girls wanted to create a social network for the school so that they would be able to prevent bullying on social media. 7th grade girls, no coding experience, but they learned a ton through that process that they would have never had the opportunity to do, never would have had that problem to solve if we didn't give them a time to do it. And for me, the important way that I distinguish this is I say, instead of asking kids what they want to learn, we need to ask kids what problems they want to solve, because when we ask them what they want to learn, they're bored and they're like, learning sucks because I do it in school all day and I hate it. But when you ask them what they want to solve, then they get these different ideas, and the things they can come up with are just amazing. So Gina, we'll definitely have to connect later and talk more about this, because I've got, like I said, a whole list of other things that these kids did that was just incredible.
I can't wait. I mean, that's one of the things, again, like, bravo to you for doing that at your school and for having the courage to ask for that. Again, like high schools, middle schools, you have advisory periods where you can do this, and amazing things happen. And sometimes, again, sometimes it's just a social emotional rest period. And that's an incredible thing too.
Yeah, so we did talk about, thank you both for that. We had the topic of 1 year. I would like to think about, since we just discussed all of this, and or if you want to work in the social context, because again, I know those are two things. It's like, what would it be like if I just took the 1 year? How would that, like, what would the transition maybe look like? Expectations, or letting go of expectations, and then like if they wanted to go back, but also like I said, the social scene. Obviously, the pandemic does create a little more challenge, but I mean, because there's always been this myth, or that homeschoolers are just isolated and they don't have, and that's why I really wanted to bring up the community end of things. And even when you said that, and it's like the grandparents involved, the neighbor involved, and like, you know, even at this time, there are probably, you know, a lot of people who want to interact on smaller scales, you know, because in some places that, you know, are safe now. And their neighbor could be the one that like is just lonely and wants to spend time with your kid, teaching them to crochet and to woodwork. And I mean, you got to look at these resources. So what can you share a little bit about any of those topics, Gina?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, if there is going to be the 1 year that you are going to choose something different, this should be the year, because everyone is in a transitional space. Everyone is sort of deciding what they want from here on out. And so even if it's just a 1 year thing, the advice is to just do it. Do it with your whole heart, enjoy the adventure, and see what comes out of it. You know, the whole unschooling, homeschooling thing doesn't have to be forever. For us, it was a year at a time. And for a family, it could be just 1 year. But if there's any time to do it, again, the whole earth is shifting, right? This is the year to do it. This is really the time to reimagine what could be done and reimagine education for your child. In terms of socializations, the big worry, the big concern with unschoolers and homeschoolers. And what I will say is, you know, socialization can look many different ways. It can look like sitting in a classroom with same age peers, or it can look like living within your community and having friends and classmates of all ages. And when you take a kid from a place where they're sitting with same age peers all day to a place where there might be more intergenerational learning and socialization, is it different? It is absolutely different, right? One of the huge benefits of unschooling that unschoolers had mentioned in Peter Gray and my research on young adult unschoolers was the age mixing. benefit. And they said, I wasn't friends with just 10-year-olds or just 14-year-olds. I was friends with, everyone from age 6 to age 95. That intergenerational socialization, that cultural transmission is really, really an important part of growing up, right? We saw it with hunter-gatherers. We see it with individuals within culture right now. As adults, we don't hang out with same-aged peers. Unschoolers or homeschoolers don't either, right? And I think that's an important point. So unschoolers will always say that was socialization as mainstream culture saw it easy? Probably not. Again, homeschoolers or unschoolers prior to the pandemic tended to be outside the mainstream. And so when they would socialize with their community, they would do volunteer work. Homeschooling is not sitting at home, right? And even in this pandemic, homeschooling didn't look like sitting at home. I saw more kids outside in neighborhoods playing together, and more like, moms and dads playing with their kids, and more grandparents playing with people than I've ever seen in my whole life. And this is in both suburban and urban, areas. So it's all about that intergenerational age mixing for homeschoolers and unschoolers. And we do need to shift a little. We need to see socialization differently. And once we shift and see the benefits of age mixing and cultural transition, that social question would be a little easier to answer. But no, homeschoolers and unschoolers are not socially deprived at all. They tend to have very, very rich social lives, but unique ones, definitely unique ones.
Yeah, previously we've talked to some teenagers that left high school, and the things they were able to access when not being time bound during the day to the schedule and all the workload of high school. But I know that there is, possibly a little bit more concern about taking 1 year off from high school if you really think it's only going to be 1 year, because I still think that that kid will get a lot out of that experience, even if their high school refuses to take their portfolio and give them credits for things, because I do think there could be some narrow-minded schools that wouldn't give them anything. And I guess that would be, worth seeing if a solution or suggestion, or I have a word on that.
Yeah, what I would say for parents is, if you are going to do that, and I'm not afraid of that at all, I'll tell you why. Interestingly, I've gotten more calls from college recruiters based on my work with unschoolers. They're like, where can we find them? Right. And I've always thought that that was so interesting. And I'm just like, they're all over. Like, where can we find them? You just have to reach out. In terms of, sort of like this whole college thing, if you are really concerned about that 1 year, take good notes. I would have every parent or guardian or whoever is going to be the facilitator for your teen take good notes on what you did during that 1 year, and really document that, whether it be a blog or whether it be just a calendar, like here's what we did, here's what they did. That's really helpful, because then you can sort of shape that 1 year into either a sabbatical year or really a year of just unschooling and learning. I would think that coming back to a high school environment, and remember, again, I work with adolescent special educators, and I'm in touch with schools in New York City and the Bronx and Queens and Manhattan and everywhere like that. I can't see a principal say, well, that was a wasted year. Right? Instead, I could see a principal say, well, that was a unique experience. And probably this person got more than they would have gotten given the state of remote learning in 2020 right now. So I never see it as a negative. It's always going to be a positive, but do document the work that everyone did during that year.
All right. So I don't know if thank you so much for that, because that was like another thing and I know there's been a lot of commentary, but if anybody has a question for Gina, we have a few more minutes. I didn't see any questions. I saw a lot of, you've answered everything and they're just high-fiving kind of, cool. But any other questions? Oh, I see Kara. Thank you, Kara.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole, and thanks, Gina. It's I'm really enjoying listening. I think we're probably of the same generation. My daughter is 25, and she didn't go to school until she was in grade 5, and we were definitely unschooling, which for me was just living our lives. Like, we just chose to not stop our lives to go fit into whatever was happening at school. And I could feel all around us that that's what was happening at that time. Like, relationships with all our close baby friends just changed in a moment because it was so clear they had stepped into another world. Yeah, so the curriculum was just whatever was happening, and I'm really drawing parallels with this time right now because I've been home for months and have lived my life, you know, since my daughter went to school. She went to grade 5, and my son started at the same time. He was 4 years old, and I've just, you know, pieced together work since then and done degrees and all sorts of things, but always with this idea that I'm still at home schooling. I'm still an at-home mom. It's just sort of the fantasy that I maintain. And I'm also an elementary supply teacher. So my heart and my being is in these two places, but always I just feel like we just need to live our lives, you know? Like, when my son was born, it was like, okay, this is the curriculum. We're just looking after a newborn and figuring out what it means to have a sibling. And sorry, I jumped. The parallel for this time is I have this time now that I've just been aching for a long, long time it's so similar to that time in that I get to see my neighbors, you know, like I'm doing work out here on my deck all the time. Sometimes I'm just reading, which is what I've longed to do forever. Just have time to read. I'm just watching these 2.5-year-old twins next door change every day, you know, and I get to mirror for those parents. Like, I get to say, I see you, and your children are so beautiful, and to just be there for people. You know, I have friends who are having a hard time right now, and I have time because I'm not going to work. I have time to respond and be there for them. So I think in terms of what could happen in schools, part of it for me is losing the language of, you know, allowing choices or giving kids freedom. That's not ours to give. That's intrinsically theirs. And I think it's about, you know, when I'm in schools, I see so much management. There's just so much micromanagement, and it really is not different in kindergarten than it is in grade 8. They pretend it's different, and they sort of tell kids they should be more mature and take responsibility, but they haven't set in place the environment for that to happen, for kids to just rise to the occasion of being in community and being there for each other and being able to live their own time, you know, like the whole place is just so weird. You know, bells and, okay, we'll start something, but oh, now my watch says now we have to stop, and now we have to start this. And I'm always, when I get to go in as the supply teacher, I get to sort of give this commentary, like, oh, this meta commentary, like, it's kind of weird now that we have to stop because the clock says this, but I guess we'll do it because that's what we're supposed to do. But I just want you to know, I see that you're deeply engrossed in something, and it's so strange to stop. And we wouldn't do that at my house. We wouldn't stop. We would just keep going. Little things like, okay, can you pay attention to me? Can you stop? Can you stop talking and pay attention to me? And so again, I often give this commentary of, so weird that I have to stop and do that. I don't do that at my house. I said, do you do that at your house? Does anybody ever stop and say, could everybody stop and look at me, please? Because we're gonna, I'm gonna give you directions for what's going to happen next. We're going to line up and come into the kitchen. Anyway, I could talk on and on and on, which is really good for me to hear myself talk and to connect with this passion around this topic.
I love your passion for it, Kara. I definitely love listening to you.
Thank you. I think it's about falling in love with kids, right? Like as teachers, maybe if you took 20 minutes and just watched, just watched and listened, you know, and if everything's okay, just take another 20 minutes. It's just, yeah. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And these are why we like to bring together people who have a shared interest, even if you're, you know, because the supply teacher is a substitute teacher kind of, right? Like you fill in or you support the teacher, right? So, you know, and then like I said, I know I talk to a lot of people who just care about education and they want to see it different, and they don't have kids, or they do have kids, but they're not really looking to do like their own school, but like just to be able to be part of conversation around, you know, this kind of conversation. So this time is set aside. It's 1 o'clock. I want to respect Gina's time. And, you know, we do this weekly meeting. It's been at 12 o'clock Eastern time. It will have to switch to 1 o'clock Eastern time because I am starting to teach my college class, where I do a lot of the very unstructured ways of support it with a podcast, and they make podcasts and they create activities, and they're supposed to be management training, you know, facilitators, and it's going to be a fun time. But it will make it so that I need to start at 1 o'clock next week. So I just wanted everybody to know that. And I would also then like to get back to some meetings where we do start to just have more time to talk amongst each other, like where we talk about who else, you know, do we want to bring in? Like Gina mentioned David Lane today, I think is, yeah, and I've met David. He was on the emergency homeschooling thing too, and I'm sure if I invited him, he would probably be welcome. So like we can talk about other people we might want to invite. And as you know, if you're not currently already in our discourse community, we have already built out the discourse community. It needs some fine tuning before it goes completely public, but we are starting to let people know that it's here, we're ready, we want to help you through this transition. You can get access to wonderful people who just want to support you, and we can bring in people who are, you know, I hate to always use the word experts, but Gina has got a lot of expertise and experience in this that I so appreciate what you brought to the table today, Gina. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for inviting me. This has been such a joy. Thank you.
Yeah, so until next week, I'm going to say goodbye.